fuck's sake. Right, so, hello and welcome to The Value of Others Part 2. Recorded the full fucking thing yesterday. Had some technical slash brain difficulties and deleted the whole thing. Basically, I filmed it in 2 parts. I've got this app that I use to try and squish the halves together to merge it into one video, but I didn't have enough storage once I'd created that to download that onto my phone to get the full video through. So I deleted both halves from my gallery, thinking it's saved separately, like online via this app, but it wasn't. So I'm gonna do it in one take today. A cigar a day keeps the doctor away. A book a day gives you wisdom, and it's stupid to be dumb. And a coffee a day keeps the tiredness at bay. Welcome to my channel, Wisdom Sharer 777, where I read books and help deliver you knowledge. You don't like reading, you don't have time to read, don't worry, you can just sit back and relax, have a snack, a cigar and a coffee, and let me read to you. Or treat this as an audiobook, and listen to it whilst you multitask. Now, where was I? That said, while awareness of the process in itself is unnecessary, or even detrimental to the individual, awareness of the output of the process is extremely important. So the question becomes, how can people be meaningfully made aware of the output of a process of which they must remain functionally ignorant? The mind has evolved an ingenious solution to this problem, namely, the calculated value coefficient is transformed into an emotion. This emotion contains the personally relevant significance of the value coefficient, and it transmits this significance in a manner that typically prevents individuals from being overwhelmed with unnecessary information and can motivate them into immediate action. This is why no one thinks I've determined that a particular good would be greatly instrumental in helping me achieve an important self-relevant goal, not only because I anticipate that the benefits associated with acquiring it will significantly exceed the costs, but because I can also conceive of no better way of achieving the same goal on the same extent with a different good that could be acquired with comparable resources at an equivalent cost-benefit ratio. Instead, they feel, I need this, or this is the one, or wow, I love that. The feelings behind these statements accomplish the same goal more elegantly than awareness of the evaluation process ever could. They communicate to the individual, and potentially to others, that a particular good is subjectively valuable, and this communication is extremely useful because it is constituted by behavioral impulses that motivate action in alignment with this valuation, to approach, to acquire, to protect, to maintain. So people do make decisions for emotional reasons. That is, the covert calculus of the evaluation process provides the rationale for the emotion that motivates decisive action. Neat. And to the extent that it's true, this explanation can also help us understand a number of other potentially puzzling phenomena. For instance, it clarifies why feelings often seem to come out of nowhere. They don't really. They are the transmuted outcomes of the evaluation process. It's simply because the process is normally so deeply unconscious that we experience the emotions as sort of arising within us. In the absence of a better understanding, we've even created a mysterious organ to help explain the origin of the origin of these feelings. The heart. When people talk about the heart in this context, they generally don't mean the electromechanical pump that circulates blood throughout the body, but a hypothesized seat of emotion capable of sensitively responding to environmental cues. And, of course, please do people do have hearts in this sense. Probably already, and they're just not where they think they are. I could say much more about this topic, however, I'm probably already pushing my luck here. So let's abandon this disquisition in favor of less rarefied realms. I promise the remainder of the book will be easier to read. The Game of Games. Applying the concept of value to human beings and the relationships they form can be unsettling and contentious. It's unsettling because we would prefer not to think that some people are more valuable than others, and it's contentious because we tend to disagree about what might contribute to those differences in value. Pardon me. However, we can largely avoid both issues by remembering that value is always assessed in relation to a personally relevant goal. For instance, a plumber is neither inherently more nor less valuable than a cardiologist. However, if your toilet backs up, you'll be calling one and not the other. This decision is not unsettling, it's common sense. So to understand why individuals enter into relationships with certain people and not others, it is extremely useful to identify the goal they are attempting to achieve. This is equivalent to asking the question, what problem of living are they attempting to solve? Fortunately, the bidirectional relationship between problem and solution helps us answer this question. That is, because your toilet is clogged, I can predict that you'll call a plumber and not a cardiologist. And because you called a plumber, I can deduce that you had an issue with your plumbing and not your heart. This personality-relevant goal organically renders certain traits, skills, and attributes more valuable than others. For example, while we all might not agree on what makes for an ideal plumber, we can reasonably predict that we will tend to value signals of responsiveness, effectiveness, and affordability in a potential candidate more heavily than, say, signals of kindness, temperance, and humor, if and when we need to hire one. This decision is not unsettling. It's common sense. It's all important to appreciate that in most cases, the traits, skills, and attributes we value more highly in those with whom we enter into relationships to solve a particular problem of living are much more influenced by the nature of the goal in question than by personal preference. This is because the value of a good is directly related to its perceived instrumentality in achieving a specific goal. If anything, it's probably more correct to think of our preference as the consequence of that perception, as opposed to the other way around. Whether we're aware of it or not, we also seem to possess exemplars, or idealized constructs, associated with specific types of relationship partners, and since thoroughly examining each individual candidate for a relationship can be both time-consuming and prohibitively expensive, one of our most common decision-making heuristics is to often unconsciously determine the perceived goodness of fit between any specific candidate and its relevant exemplar. The greater the perceived fit, the more likely we will select a given option, all other things being equal. What's more, this process is influenced by contextual factors in predictable ways. For example, the less important the goal a given relationship will attempt to achieve in an individual's nested hierarchy of games, the lower this individual's selection threshold will be with respect to the perceived goodness of fit. That is, for a less important decision, we are more likely to consider a decent match to be good enough. However, for a more important decision, we would likely hold off until we found a better option, provided we weren't under an urgent time constraint. To understand why individuals enter into relationships with certain people and not others, it is extremely useful to identify the exemplars against which they are comparing candidates. Fortunately, the bidirectional relationship between exemplars and selection helps us in this process. That is, because I know your exemplar, I can predict that you'll choose to enter into a relationship with a specific person, and not another, to achieve a specific goal. And because you've chosen to enter into a relationship with a certain individual to achieve a specific goal, I can deduce the features of your exemplar with sufficient data. I simply make the best coffee, and I don't understand why I would go somewhere and pay £4 or £5 for a coffee which is shit. Like literal shit on the bottom of my shoe compared to a home brew. When we apply all these considerations to sexual relationships, it's easy to see why the game of mating and dating can be so confusing. In the first place, it's important to understand that, for the majority, for the vast majority of people, this game is very high in the nested hierarchy of games. As the saying goes, all's fair in love and war. To the extent that this is true, it is true because both of those games are fundamentally concerned about survival. And we generally expect the game of survival to take precedence over all other games for the simple reason that losing that game typically makes it impossible to win the others. While the game of war is associated with the survival of the individual organism, the game of love is associated with the survival of the individual's genes. From an evolutionary standpoint, an organism that lives to a ripe old age without reproducing not only dies, it goes extinct. At some level, it lost the game of survival because it did not find a way to perpetuate itself through time. Indeed, it seems that genetic survival is a more important goal than individual survival for perhaps all living beings, including humans. A mother who dies so her children might live exemplifies this phenomenon. Just as humans have evolved biological and physiological mechanisms to facilitate their own individual survival, they have evolved other mechanisms to assist with the survival of their genes. As a consequence, the game of mating and dating ranks very highly in most people's nested hierarchy of games, in many cases above their own individual survival. In many respects, it is the game of games, the game that makes all other games possible. This explains a number of things. For example, if the game of mating and dating is associated with the most superordinate goal of all, i.e., genetic survival, then we should not only expect a constant passive surveillance for new information pertaining to that goal, but also a willingness to prioritize this goal over all others when sufficiently attractive opportunities present themselves. This is why the sexual marketplace is functionally everywhere, and why people are subject to doing all kinds of hurtful, shameful, and desperate things in the service of this goal. A starving person is likely not proud of choosing to steal food, and we probably wouldn't uphold the behavior as an exemplar for ethical conduct, but we would almost certainly understand this person's decision. Since the value of a good is related to its perceived instrumentality in achieving a particular goal and to how highly that goal is ranked in an individual's nested hierarchy of games, we can now appreciate why those with whom we enter into relationships can be among the most valuable people in our lives, and why that value can fluctuate so dramatically over the course of a relationship. After all, a plumber is much more valuable to us before he fixes our clog than he is after he does so. People might balk at this, but no one continues to pay the plumber after the job is finished. Though potentially challenging and frustrating, the changing priority of our goals, and therefore the fluctuating value of any given person for a particular relationship over time, might be navigable were it not for two additional variables that significantly complicate the matter further, namely goal conflation and lack of awareness. Let's look at each in turn. It can be hard enough to get what you want from a specific person. However, this process becomes exponentially more difficult if you want many different things from that specific person. We can call this goal conflation, which occurs when a single means, i.e., a specific relationship, is used to pursue multiple goals, e.g., sex, security, friendship. Simultaneously, goal conflation makes every aspect of a relationship more challenging because completely satisfying options will be both rare and expensive. As a result, most people will not be able to get everything they want from a single person, and this means when it comes to relationships, there aren't any solutions, only trade offs. And this system of trade offs becomes increasingly more complicated in direct proportion to the number of things we want from any given person. Not only will the things we want fluctuate in importance over time, but they will fluctuate differentially as well. This will alter the relative priority of what we want from any particular person, and this, in turn, will affect how much we value that person by influencing our perception of the trade offs involved. Let's say a given woman might not be the most beautiful, but she may be very good with children. This trade-off will not only cause different men to value the same woman differently, but it will cause the same man to value the same woman differently at different points in time. A husband who was willing to forego an attractive sexual opportunity for the sake of a woman's maternal instincts will likely be less willing to do so once his children are grown up. This is because, if nothing else changes, the same woman will have become less valuable to him. This is not only because the woman can no longer help him achieve one of his personally relevant goals, i.e., raising children, but also because this goal is no longer highly ranked for having been achieved. The cruel reality is that she will have become less valuable to him for having given him what he wanted. Remember, no one continues to pay the plumber. In light of this, we can understand why staying together over a lifetime can be such a difficult task, and why relationship longevity is so closely related to responding effectively to the way certain trade-offs evolve over time as a result of goal conflation. So, my aunt, the queen of gossip, visited the other day, yesterday. She has had 3 marriages so far, and she's supposedly Christian, a church attender. And she's been divorced that many times and got with a new man on the level of marriage 3 times. So, yeah, goes to show. I mean, maybe it really is that hard to stay together for a lifetime. And I've heard some people say, I mean, back in the days when the Bible was wrote and such, and well, it depends which bit you're going to, but in parts of time when marriage was made a legal, government contract and such, and when it was a lot more normalized, people had a lot lower life expectancy. People were dropping off in their 40s, sometimes in their 30s. Like 50s was like 100, People lived half the time. So marrying for life and having kids, it was manageable. You were like, okay, well, we're only going to be, the kids are grown up. If you moved out of a house, people had kids young. Say you're having the kids at 20, then they're grown up by the time you're, well, say you're having kids at 18, they're grown up by the time you're, 35, 36, then you've probably maybe got a decade or less of life anyway. Maybe one of the parents has already died off. So you got married to have kids, and like that was kind of your lifespan. That was it. But now people can live a lot longer with medicine and I don't know, the world not having shit down the streets and stuff. Depends where you live. So people feel like they're living multiple lives, and it's hard to stick with the same person because you have so much time to change and evolve and learn and go through phases, So that's my little 2 cents, but back to the page. That said, the man in the previous paragraph likely would not have consciously formulated his situation in those terms, and this brings us to the second significant complicator: lack of awareness. As you'll recall, most of the valuation process is buried in the unconscious most of the time. What's more, the individual is generally only made aware of the outcome of this process when the value coefficient is transmuted into an emotion. And with respect to sexual relationships, the emotion into which this value coefficient is transmuted is desire. The more a particular person is perceived to be valuable, that is, the more this person is perceived to be capable of achieving more of an individual's most highly ranked, personally relevant goals as prioritized in that specific moment, the more this particular person will be desired by the individual in question. This is the true, though perhaps unsatisfying, definition of a high-value man or woman. It is a person we perceive as being able to give us more of what is most important to us, given the current prioritization of our goals. What's more, this person's ability to give us more of what is most important to us should not be compromised by any significant liabilities that would negate the benefits we hope to accrue in a relationship with him or her. That is, a high-value person also gives us less of what we don't want. When both of these are true, then the individual is perceived to be a net positive in the context of our hyperconflated goal set. The bigger the net positive, the higher the person's perceived value, and the more desire we experience. Of course, whether we act on the impulses that constitute that desire, e.g., to approach, to acquire, to protect, depends on a host of other factors, e.g., perceived availability, intersexual competition, available resources. However, we can't help but feel desire as a consequence of that perception. From this perspective, we can understand that saying people desire a high-value individual is a tautology, as desire is the natural emotional response to the perception of high value. It's equivalent to saying that people desire a desirable individual, and this is because value and desire are the same thing experienced in different ways. As a result, our hypothetical husband probably wouldn't think of his wife as less valuable to him because she now provides less of what he wants and potentially more of what he doesn't want, in the context of his evolving, hyperconflated goal set for the relationship, which thereby renders his marriage increasingly expensive, especially in the context of an optionality that may include more affordable alternatives over time. That sentence was a fucking mouthful. And if he does think this way, he will likely feel guilty for doing so, as this type of thinking violates a tacit social convention with respect to sexual relationships. It's much more likely that our hypothetical husband will respond to his circumstances by feeling less attracted to his wife. The diminishment of his desire is the result of his potentially unconscious perception that his wife has become less valuable to him. Given his personally relevant goals, he may feel confused or frustrated or embarrassed in response to this diminishment. But, to the extent that desire represents the transmuted perception of value in sexual relationships, he won't be able to prevent it. That said, he may attempt to avoid experiencing this change in his desire in a variety of ways, e.g., drinking more, avoiding his wife, devoting more time to his work, with varying degrees of success. In the context of sexual relationships, our emotional response to the perception of a high-value individual is desire, and this feeling motivates us to initiate or maintain a relationship with the individual in question. On the other hand, our emotional response to the perception of a low-value individual, i.e., someone we perceive to be a net negative in the context of our hyper-conflated goal set, is disgust. And this feeling motivates us to avoid or escape a relationship with the individual in question. Finally, our emotional response to the perception of a mid-value individual, i.e., someone we perceive to be net neutral in the context of our hyperconflated goal set, depends on the number of intensity of the benefits and liabilities involved. If we perceive that a person might be capable of giving us a few things we kinda want and a few things we kinda don't, we typically feel indifferent. We could take or leave the opportunity this person represents. However, if we perceive that a person might be able to give us a lot of what we really want and a lot of what we really don't, then we typically feel conflicted, and this is because both our desire and our disgust are active at the same time. This suggests that more than one value coefficient is calculated for any particular good. Most likely, there is a coefficient associated with at least each of the inherent behavioral routines that constitute the primary emotions, just like all visible hues can be created through various combinations of the three primary colors. All our feelings can be created through various combinations of the six primary emotions. That is, we feel powerfully drawn to and repulsed by the same individual simultaneously. This is called an approach avoidance conflict, and it can trap people in agonizing decision for years. Incidentally, the foregoing also helps explain why people ignore red flags, at least in otherwise attractive individuals. Red flags are traits or behaviors that signify that you're dealing with a bitch. Red flags are traits or behaviors that signify that a liability that is not, or only marginally present now, might be present or much more present in the future. The issue is that, just as the same benefit is always more valuable in the present than in the future, the same liability is always less detrimental in the future than in the present. This is because a chance always exists that neither the future benefit nor the future liability will actually come to pass, which influences the weighting of the value of each in proportion to the likelihood of its obtaining. This causes people to rationally undervalue potential future liabilities, which then contributes to tipping their perception of any given individual in the direction of a net positive. When people perceive someone to have many of the goods they most want right now, a few of the goods they don't want right now, that is, when they're dealing with an apparently high value individual, then they will feel a great deal of desire for this person right now. And this positive emotion will reciprocally influence their valuation process in predictable ways, namely, by weighting values associated with current benefits more heavily and weighting values associated with future liabilities more lightly. This is in the service of motivating action in alignment with their valuations. Given this feedback loop, it can take a fair amount of wisdom and forbearance to resist being emotionally swept away in the face of an extremely attractive option, virtues that are generally only cultivated as a consequence of the pain associated with not resisting such an impulse in the past. On the other hand, people are typically better able to keep their wits about them when dealing with less obviously attractive individuals, since they perceive these people to have fewer of the goods they most want. Their valuation isn't quite so positive, even in the apparent absence of liabilities. This causes them to experience less desire, which mitigates the process described earlier. Ultimately, it is this reciprocal relationship between the perception of value and desire that explains why attractive people tend to receive all kinds of allowances that less attractive people don't, including the tendency to discount or minimize the implications of their bad behavior. Liking what you hear so far? Just comment an emoji. Whatever emoji fits best. When models fail. While there are many ways in which a lack of awareness significantly complicates the pursuit and maintenance of sexual relationships, I'd like to discuss one final consideration that will be particularly relevant to our subsequent discussions. It is this. If the process of determining value is comprised of a countless number of individual evaluations, each associated with a specific weight that attempts to predict the importance of that evaluation to the achievement of a particular goal, and if the evaluation process is almost entirely unconscious, then, to a large extent, people will be unaware of precisely what they value and the extent to which they value those things. For instance, a woman who consciously thinks she wants a nice man to settle down with, but who constantly finds herself getting involved in short-term relationships with exploitative bad boys, is completely in the dark with respect to her actual goals and values, which are revealed by examining her choices. Such a woman might even vigorously deny that she has a type, so profound the lack of awareness of her own preferences might be. This is hardly unusual. Furthermore, irrespective of how progressive and open-minded we collectively consider ourselves to be, certain goals and values will always remain socially unacceptable. This means that even if we were aware of that process from others and even ourselves, as a result, it is generally useless to directly ask people what they want in a sexual partner. Even if they could tell you the whole story, and they can't, they wouldn't. This is due to the fact that sharing some parts of that story would result in social censure, and other parts might compromise the attainment of their goals. Just like a job interviewer can't be completely transparent about the actual criteria for selection, as doing so would significantly increase the likelihood that candidates would simply tell the interviewer what she wants to hear. People are generally forced into some measure of dissimulation when trying to get what they want from the opposite sex. The most significant consequence of the unconscious nature of the valuation process is that, while there is always a rational basis for people's attraction, i.e., it is the it is the transmutation of a value coefficient into an emotion, what people are attracted to is not always rationally aligned with their best interests, or even their consciously explicated goals. This is due to the fact that, while the valuation process is inherent, the weights and evaluations used in that process are not. People can't help but constantly and unconsciously value the objects of their perception according to their personally relevant goals. This tendency is backed into our neurobiology and might only be surmountable through enlightenment level self-awareness and self-control. On the other hand, what people value, and how much they value those things, is not entirely biologically determined. It is both mediated by perception, which is not always reliable, and informed by culture, which creates significant variability across time and space. As humans, we are born with the capacity to value, just like we are born with the capacity for language. However, precisely what we value often depends on much of the culture into which we are born, as does our native language. People realize the potential inherent in both of these capacities primarily through observation of the world around them. In many respects, the brain is like a machine learning algorithm. It is hardwired with certain computational pathways, but it must be trained on data to function properly. And how accurately and efficiently such an algorithm performs is intended purpose. And how accurately and efficiently such an algorithm performs its intended purpose is directly related to the data to which it is trained on. These data not only constitute the inputs of the algorithm, they are also capable of altering the structure and process of the algorithm itself. These alterations can then influence the inputs of the algorithm in a reciprocal fashion. We can call the evolving outcome of this interdependent system the evaluation algorithm, when it is concerned with determining the instrumentality of perceived objects to our self-relevant goals. With respect to influencing the development of the valuation algorithm for sexual relationships, the most significant culture into which people are born is their home environment. Whether they want to or not, children principally train their valuation algorithm on the data collected by observing the relationships of their primary caregivers. And while I can think of no better alternative, this is subject to creating difficulties for people further down the road for two reasons. Both are inevitable and inescapable, in that they impact everyone, to some extent. The first reason is related to the quantity of our training data. If each of our valuation algorithms for sexual relationships is principally trained on data collected from just one relationship, then our algorithms will be unduly biased by the idiosyncratic features of that relationship. This is comparable to using one specific sparrow not only as the exemplar for all other sparrows, but also for all other birds. Penguins, ostriches, and condors are fully just as avian as sparrows, but an algorithm trained exclusively on sparrows, let alone one specific sparrow, probably wouldn't even recognize them as birds. We could call this the law of small numbers as applied to relationships, and it skews our valuations irrespective of the nature of the relationships on which they were trained. Consider that a child raised by a bitter and resentful single mother will likely develop a very different valuation algorithm than one developed by a child raised by two loving and engaged parents. Each will value different things differently. However, both will experience bias in their valuation algorithms in the same way. This is, unless their biases are subsequently corrected with additional data, both children will likely grow up thinking that the relationship on which each of their algorithms was trained is the way all relationships should look. The issue is that no one relationship, no matter the relationship, can serve as the exemplar for all relationships. This is not to say that there are no differences between healthy, functional relationships and unhealthy, dysfunctional relationships. There are. It is to say that there are many different ways for relationships to be healthy and functional, though perhaps not quite as many as there are ways for relationships to be unhealthy and dysfunctional. When people's valuation algorithms are skewed by the law of small numbers, their capacities to perceive the multiplicity of ways they can effectively structure their relationships, and the multiplicity of people with whom they can have those relationships are compromised. Even if they were raised under ideal conditions, unfortunately, the unconscious nature of this bias can prevent people from even recognizing plausible relationship candidates, making the selection process even more difficult and restrictive. It may even be in people's best interest to deviate from the outputs of their algorithms, especially if those outputs constrain them to more costly methods of attaining their goals. The second reason the home environment creates difficulties is related to the quality of our training data. If each of our valuation algorithms for sexual relationships is principally trained on data collected from just one relationship, and this one relationship inevitably achieves the goals of its constituents in a suboptimal or even dysfunctional manner, then all of our sexual relationship algorithms contain weights and values that have no business being there. To some extent, and without exception, all people utilize algorithms that contain valuations that are either irrelevant or antagonistic to their goals. That is, they value things that don't matter too highly, because these things are not actually instrumental to getting what they want, and they often value things that do matter incorrectly, because they have been trained to approach what instrumentality they should avoid, and vice versa. Irrelevant valuations are liabilities because they reduce the pool of satisfactory options for any given type of relationship, which has significant economic consequences, including criteria that do not actually help you achieve your personally relevant goals, will typically require you to spend more time and energy in the selection process and transact more resources to secure and maintain any satisfactory opportunity, if and when it finally presents itself. Focusing on irrelevant criteria can also distract you from more important considerations. However, antagonistic valuations are even more problematic because they effectively sabotage goal-directed efforts. These valuations make it less likely that people will get what they want, and more likely that people will get what they don't want. The kicker is that they do this irrespective of the given individual's awareness. For instance, the hypothetical woman who doesn't understand why she keeps ending up in short-term relationships with exploitative men may not be aware of how her early experiences trained her relationship algorithm to highly value certain traits in a partner that are actually counterproductive to a healthy, long-term relationship, e.g., emotional availability, emotional volatility, spontaneity, fantasy, and to lowly value other traits that are related to that goal, e.g., emotional regulation, dependability, maturity. She is aware of her goal, but she is not aware of how her process, i.e., her valuation algorithm, is leading her astray. But here's the thing. Even if she was made aware of this process, it wouldn't necessarily change her choices. This is because awareness is technically insufficient to effect change, although it is potentially helpful in doing so. Even if this woman were to, say, go to therapy and come to understand how her childhood experiences influenced her unconscious valuation of prospective sexual partners in dysfunctional ways, she might still find herself in short-term relationships with exploitative men. This is because, if nothing else changes, this woman will still continue to desire exploitative men, even if she completely understands why she does so and why this desire is at cross purposes with her best interests. Her awareness might prevent her from acting on this desire, but it won't prevent her from feeling the desire for the wrong man, or enable her to start feeling the desire for the right ones. When people become aware of the extent to which their valuation algorithms have been trained on bad data, they become increasingly cognizant of a serious double bind. Basically, within their subjective experience, they feel as though they are forced to choose between entering into a dysfunctional relationship with someone they authentically desire and entering into a functional relationship with someone they feel nothing for. Obviously, both both options are problematic, but this double bind will remain in effect until their valuation algorithms are appropriately corrected. Less than merely 2 pages left. And the most effective way to correct them is to flood these algorithms with better data. It's not possible to erase the experiences on which these algorithms were trained. That would fundamentally require meddling with people's memories, which is problematic for a whole host of reasons. Rather, the idea is to expose people to so much good data that the bad data on which they were trained are rendered increasingly irrelevant, mind you. This would this could alter their valuation algorithms to be more aligned with their best interests. By means of the reciprocal process previously described, doing so will literally change how individuals perceive actual and potential relationship partners, and as their perception changes, so too will their desire, as mediated by an altered valuation algorithm brought about through corrective experience. My point here is that it is not necessary to judge the hypothetical woman for her relationship choices or the hypothetical man for his diminished attraction to his wife. any more than it would be necessary for these individuals, if they existed, to judge themselves. Rather, we can understand the desires of both constructs to be the rational and expected outcomes of an extremely complex and almost entirely unconscious valuation process, and their decisions to be the reasonable and predictable consequences of their attempts to achieve as many of their constantly fluctuating and personally relevant goals as possible with the most economical expenditure of their available resources. All this neither eliminates personal accountability nor dispenses with free will. While our desires may not entirely be our fault, they remain our responsibilities. However, it's my hope that this understanding may open up new opportunities to relate to each other more humanely. And this is critical, as we can truly only love to the depth of our understanding. How sweet. In this chapter, I introduced some of the fundamental principles of the economic model of relationships, because people want things from others. They enter into relationships. And because this process is subject to certain laws and rules, people must play the game of relationships to get these things. Individuals enter into relationships with their perceived best options, which means that the perception of value resides at the heart of all relationships. Value is calculated by an extremely complex and almost entirely unconscious process, the outcome of which is transformed into an emotion that impels people to act in line with that outcome. In the context of sexual relationships, this emotion is desire. However, desire remains mysterious, even to ourselves, due to goal conflation and a lack of awareness of our own functioning. If people must transact their sexual relationships in the game of mating and dating, then there must be a field of play. In the next chapter, we will discuss the nature of this field, the sexual marketplace. If you'd like to further explore the topics presented in this chapter, please scan the QR code to access a curated playlist on the Psych Hacks channel on YouTube. You probably don't have the ability to scan it, seeing as I'm showing on your screen, but if you get this on your laptop, then scan with your phone, although it's probably not clear enough. But hey ho, let's give it a go. I'll hold it still, open this on your laptop, and then pause the video, and then see if you can scan it with your phone. Otherwise, just look up Orion Taraban Psych Hacks YouTube channel. Anyway, thanks for tuning in. Next up is chapter 2. I hope you have enjoyed the video. Don't forget to spend some time in nature. And have a good day. Signing out.